Kellyanne Butler is a Mi'kmaq woman and scholar who currently resides in St. John's. Her strong Mi'kmaq roots come from her mother, Marina, whose family is from the community of Seal Rocks, now known as Turf Point in the town of St. George's, on the west coast of the island of Newfoundland. She is an ethnohistorian with a focus on comparative Indigenous studies and a commitment to direct collaboration with Indigenous communities in her teaching, engagement, and research. Ms. Butler is currently the Indigenous Education Specialist in the Office of Indigenous Affairs, holds an adjunct appointment with the School of Arts and Social Science at Grenfell campus, and was a member of the working group that wrote the Research Impacting Indigenous Groups policy. Hello, Kellyanne, and welcome, and you may start your presentation when you feel most appropriate.
Thanks, Ivan. And thanks to everyone that is here. So I want to first set up, so whenever I give a presentation about anything involving Indigenous, whether it's policy, people, histories, etc., there's a lot of background information that needs to be shared in addition to the specific topic. And there's reason for that. And I'll say that in a second, but I wanted to first tell everyone why I wanted to give this session. So as Ivan mentioned, I was on the working group that wrote the policy. Actually, the working group facilitated a bunch of engagement sessions with Indigenous groups and also then with people, excuse me, inside the university over a period of time. It was extremely extensive consultation. And then we went about writing the policy. And after that, I became the chair of the Committee on Ethical Research Impacting Indigenous Groups and spent up until just very, very recently, spent about 2 years as chair of that committee. And in that role, and also because we had gaps in having an AVP, Indigenous Research, in place, I ended up taking on I guess a larger role in the implementation of the policy in terms of I was called in and engaged in numerous conversations with people who were trying to navigate the policy. I also had the pleasure of observing, because I'm on the committee that sees a lot of the proposal and consent forms coming through, that I had the pleasure of observing just numerous people who were, just and are just happily engaging in the policy and I guess because of their, background, having already established relationships with Indigenous groups, having an easier time of navigating that policy than people who maybe hadn't had interactions with Indigenous groups previous to finding out that they had to follow this policy. So I wanted to give this session because one of the questions that has been coming up, of course, is how to handle classroom situations where students want to do specific projects, or if it's a methods class where there's this piece where students are asked to do certain tasks to learn how to acquire skills to help them move forward. So if I wanted to do it this way, in the sense that it saves on, in the future, a whole bunch of different one-on-one talks, which this way people can hopefully walk away today with more information than you had when you started. And then if you have questions, because I mean, it's a new policy, it's something that's new to the university in the sense that a lot of people haven't been engaging with this. So there will still be questions. I'm just trying to sort of reduce the number of questions and kind of lay a little bit of a foundation for people to understand a little bit more about how it came about, and then what you can do in the classroom to avoid any sort of problem. So that's why I, excuse me, that's why I wanted to do this. And so, as I said, whenever I give presentations on these sorts of topics, there's an issue of background information and having common understandings. And I'm going to quote, so what's going to happen here is there's going to be 5 to 10 minutes of me giving like background history, because I don't think we can have a discussion starting at a certain point where we're not all in the same place. So there's a woman named Shawneen Peach. She's a Cree scholar from Saskatchewan. She currently works in Indigenous education in British Columbia, but previously she was the president of First Nations University in Saskatchewan, and she was also the executive lead on indigenization at the University of Regina. So she was in a similar role to someone like Catherine Anderson. So Shawneen Peach came out and gave a talk at Grenfell campus, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, and then the next day came to the St. John's campus and gave the same talk. And in this talk she was talking about indigenization, decolonization, and so on. And one of the things that she said, and which is true, is that we've all been structurally denied the opportunity to learn Indigenous histories in our education. Every one of us. So it's something that everyone has in common, whether we're Indigenous, we're not Indigenous, whether we're domestic Canadian, whether we've just come recently from other places, and so on. If we have been educated in North America, really, but also other places in the world, but in this context, North America, we've been structurally denied that opportunity. So we didn't learn things in our kindergarten through grade 12 education that allowed us to have a basis to move from. And so because of that, this is how we end up with concerns on the part of Indigenous communities about research that's happening in their communities, and then the need to do something about that. And so if we think about the history of research that impacts Indigenous peoples, historically that research has been conducted primarily by people who are not Indigenous. So non-Indigenous researchers have done the vast majority of research impacting Indigenous peoples or involving Indigenous peoples in any way over a long period of time. And this has created problems for Indigenous communities in the sense that a lot of the stories that get told about us, a lot of the histories that are shared, they don't come from our perspectives. A lot of times, totally inadvertently, they just replicate stereotypes. They cause harm, and certainly don't benefit Indigenous communities. So, and in this province, it's particularly striking due to the unique nature of the history of Indigenous peoples with respect to the rest of Canada. So, without going into too much history, in 1949, as we all know, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, Newfoundland and Labrador became a province of Canada, joined Confederation in 1949. And over the course of the negotiations that took place over like a 2-year period leading up to the actual signing of the terms of union, Indigenous peoples were part of the conversation. There was from all sides a desire to sort of toss off any responsibility onto the other party. So the federal government not really wanting any responsibility, the delegation from Newfoundland and Labrador not wanting any responsibility. Ultimately, although in successive drafts of the terms of union, Indigenous peoples appeared in those drafts, the final draft of the terms of union completely erased Indigenous peoples. So there was no mention whatsoever of Indigenous peoples in the 1949 terms of union, even though the previous drafts of those terms of union did include all kinds of discussion, solutions, ideas of ways to move forward, and all of that was cut out of the last piece. And so that final draft doesn't say anything about Indigenous peoples. And there's a consequence to that. So in 1951, the federal government undertook a complete federal census of Indigenous peoples. And I say complete, that's the way it's described by the federal government. They went across the entirety of Canada and did a census of all Indigenous peoples, but they did not come to Newfoundland or Labrador. And they didn't do that because the 1949 terms of union didn't mention any Indigenous people. And so the significance of that is that census from 1951 is where everything else flows from. Any sort of voice, any sort of right to have a say in discussions at the federal level or about Indigenous peoples, anything. Indigenous peoples in Newfoundland and Labrador were completely left out of that. And I'm telling you this because it affects the attitude that people have or the understandings that people have about Indigenous peoples in this province. So there's a popular narrative that presupposes that all of these people came out of nowhere, or that there were just these few tiny little pockets, mostly in Labrador. And the reality is that there have been Indigenous peoples all over the province since, long before it was a province. But that 1951 federal census sort of erased Indigenous peoples in terms of federal understandings. And that affects the way that research is conducted as well. And so you see all of these different groups in the 20th century, the late 20th century, negotiating with the federal government for recognition. That all stems back to the 1949 Terms of Union and that 1951 census. So that's just an important little piece there to consider when we talk about why RIIG is important in this province. Research Impacting Indigenous Groups policy. So I also want to share that by the second day that I worked for this university, which was in 2015, by my second day, I had already heard 5 stories from Indigenous community members about research that had a negative impact on their communities. In September of 2015, which was 3 months after I started, I did a road trip with a colleague from the St. John's campus. We drove from Corner Brook up the Northern Peninsula, crossed on the ferry, and then drove from Blas up to Cartwright and back. And we went to all of the schools, secondary schools along the south coast of Labrador, and talked to Indigenous students about coming to Memorial University, whether they wanted to come to Grenfell campus, or they wanted to come to the St. John's campus, or to take courses that were available at the Labrador Institute. And during that trip, when we went into these different small communities, and we were in one of those burgundy Memorial University trucks, a big pickup truck with the iceberg logo on the side. In each of the communities that we went to, we would drive through the community. We were going to visit the schools, but we wanted to actually see all these places and all of these tiny little communities all along that coast. And in one of the communities, we were driving through very slowly, a cute little small community. And as we're going down the street and I was driving, an elderly gentleman walks out into the middle of the road and like puts his hand up for us to stop. I stopped, obviously, but he immediately walked around to the driver's side, and I had the window rolled down to ask him what was, what he needed. And he launched into, I guess, chastising me that I don't have permission to be there to collect soil samples. So, and I wasn't there to collect soil samples. And I explained that to him. We ended up having a lovely chat, and he wanted us to come have lunch with him and everything. But what's important is that the initial reaction that he had to seeing a Memorial University truck in his community was negative. And he wanted to let me know immediately, we don't have permission to be collecting soil samples. And so as we worked on talking with Indigenous communities about their experiences with research, these are the kinds of stories that came out. That's not to say that there weren't also super positive stories. There are many of them, and there are some researchers at the university who have been working closely with Indigenous communities for decades and having wonderful research collaborations. But the concern is about the other stories, right? And so I, from the time I started at the university, have been receiving information from Indigenous communities continually about things that are happening that they want to see done differently. I've also, over that same course of time, or from prior to that up until today, I've also been a research subject for numerous research projects related to Indigenous cultures, histories, and knowledges, including some that are undertaken by students. And I have had experiences with both, ethical, respectful examples and also some unethical examples. And the unethical examples are usually unintended. It's unintended negative repercussions. So that's another piece that I want you to understand in terms of the history of how we get to this place where we are now. The other thing I wanted to give to you as a foundation is some history around the Tri-Council Policy Statement, which most people know as a TCPS 2. That document is important because the RIIG policy is actually based on that. And a lot of people seem very shocked when I tell them that, but I think it comes from not really engaging very much with that TCPS 2, and some, depending on when you came up in your education, that you could have been engaging with a previous version. And then when new versions have been published, it's just human nature. We only engage with the pieces that we believe affect, that have to do with what we're doing. So the Tri-Council Policy Statement history, drafts of what originally was called a code began in 1994 and then had some revisions in 1996. And then 1998, you see the first complete policy statement comes out. And it was met with just a huge amount of disagreement, contention, indignation. This was the first time that there was any comprehensive policy that presumed to, I guess, prescribe ethical behaviors between researchers and human subjects. Up until that time, this would be something personal, like a person would, whoever the researcher was, would just be doing everything on their own in terms of what they believed to be ethical. And there wasn't any sort of guiding document or guideline. And when that first policy statement came out, people were extremely resistant to it. It was one of those, the sky is falling, taking things to the furthest extreme of how negative it could be or how badly it's going to affect their research. I mean, it was a huge, huge issue. But over time, people came to understand it, came to realize that the codification that is contained in those policy statements really doesn't really differ very much from the behaviors they were already exhibiting. So that's the first complete policy statement. And then by 2005 is the first time that Indigenous peoples are actually discussed in the TCPS2, or in the TCPS at that time. And in that first iteration of any sort of section involving Indigenous peoples, they noted that they hadn't engaged enough yet with Indigenous groups themselves, so that they were describing that very small section as a starting point of a conversation. And from the very beginning, the TCPS has been presented as something that is in continual updating, so that it's not supposed to be just this flat document that exists over time and never changes. It is continually being revised, and those revisions, they have stated, come primarily from the interaction between the policy statement and the actual researchers and the subjects, so that they're learning all the time and then they update. And it's, I mean, I think there's a quote from Maya Angelou about, when you know better, you do better. And this is what the TCPS has been about. So 2005 is the first mention of Indigenous peoples specifically. And over time, from the beginning, the scope also increased, because initially you're talking just about individual human subjects, and then it grows to encompass biological materials, so human materials as well, which was also something that people were very resistant to. So by 2018, we're now into the TCPS2. So this like formal and much more encompassing change in the policy. So it went from just a policy statement to the policy statement 2. In 2018, the first paragraph of Article 2.1 specifically refers to course-based research as being included in the scope of the policy. The 2014 version of the policy statement doesn't include any mention of that. And so this is really significant for those who are under the impression that the RIIG policy is somehow introducing this completely new thing about classroom research. That's not true. That has been codified for more than 4 years in the TCPS 2. And also any of the references I'm making when I'm talking about clauses and chapters, paragraphs, if you shoot me an email, my email is kabutler@mun.ca. If you shoot me an email after this presentation, I'm happy to send you, all the little notes about what section you can look to find whatever the thing is that I've said that you're curious about. So what's important is just the inclusion of classroom-based research has been under the TCPS 2 for more than 4 years already. And I would imagine that most people are not compliant simply because they don't realize that it's already there. So let's get to the RIIG policy now. As I mentioned, there's a history of concerns that have been brought forward over time from Indigenous communities, including comments that the research doesn't reflect the interests or needs of the communities themselves, that the research is extractive, that researchers arrive to communities with already pre-planned research agendas and don't appear to have any interest in what the community wishes. And again, I want to say, this doesn't mean that all researchers are like this. This is experiences that Indigenous groups have said are concerning to them, that happen continually. As I said, we have numerous researchers at this university who do beautiful work with community. They are in active collaboration over time. They've done multiple projects together with Indigenous communities. But we also have, like every other place, we also have people who they're just not informed enough to do it in a way that respects what the communities wish. So Indigenous communities have been adamant that research conducted in their territories has to be relevant to their community and that they must have free, prior, informed consent before a research plan is devised. So just to kind of recap and set the parameters of what I'm going to say here about classroom research. So Chapter 9 of the TCPS 2 acknowledges the unique status of Indigenous peoples. Chapter 9 also says that the chapter is offered in a spirit of respect. And this is a quote, "It is not intended to override or replace ethical guidance offered by Indigenous peoples themselves. Its purpose is to ensure, to the extent possible, that research involving Indigenous peoples is premised on respectful relationships. It also encourages collaboration and engagement between researchers and participants." That Article 2.1 on the scope of the policy, quote, "includes course-based research activities, the primary purpose of which is pedagogical because of the possible risks to those recruited to participate in such activities and the fact that from their perspective, such activities may appear totally indistinguishable from those that meet the policy's definition of research." So this is the piece that specifically identifies classroom-based research as falling under the scope of the TCPS 2. And the reason I'm continually talking about the TCPS 2 is because RIIG follows out of that policy statement. Also, that research involving Indigenous peoples in Canada has been defined and carried out primarily by non-Indigenous researchers. The approaches used have not generally reflected Indigenous worldviews, and the research has not necessarily benefited Indigenous peoples or communities. As a result, Indigenous peoples continue to regard research, particularly research originating outside their communities, with apprehension and mistrust. Also, that the TCPS 2 applies to agency and non-agency funded research and also applies to non-funded research that takes place under the auspices of any institution that is associated with receiving funding from any of the Tri-Council. Chapter 3 of TCPS 2 codifies that consent can be withdrawn at any time. That's another piece of the RIIG policy that people have been surprised about, but that actually comes from the TCPS 2. So Memorial's Research Impacting Indigenous Groups policy is based on and borrows language directly from the current TCPS2, but it differs in these ways. And it's just a couple things. It differs in that it extends the concept of community to be Indigenous based and therefore includes Indigenous territories and not solely Indigenous individuals. That comes from Indigenous peoples. It is different from the TCPS2 in terms of the point in the research where consent must be demonstrated. So Indigenous communities have said, you can't just come to us with this pre-planned research agenda and you've already applied for funding and now tell us that you want us to participate. So the RIIG policy, this is the biggest piece that makes it so unique and has been, I guess, written about as the first in Canada. This is it. It's not about the parameters of what constitutes consent. It's about when that happens. And the fact that it happens at the concept development phase and not at the point at which you already have your funding and now you're going into the community with already got the money, already have the plan, and now we just want to insert an Indigenous community. Indigenous communities say you can't do that anymore. So everything else that you find in the RIIG policy is already codified in TCPS2. It already includes classroom course-based research. It already includes funded and non-funded research, and it already includes that consent can be withdrawn at any time. So now let's actually talk about it in the classroom. What does that mean in the classroom? RIIG in the classroom. So there are two distinct student groups or course classroom groups that would be affected by this. And that would be undergraduate students and graduate students. And they have different situations, right? So in an undergraduate situation, there are two primary ways that undergraduate student research would engage or come in contact with the RIIG policy. And that's in methods courses, for example, where research methods or oral history methods are being taught to students. And usually in those cases, there's some sort of specific class project where everyone has some similar thing that they have to do, but maybe they pick different topics that they're going to do it on. So it could involve interviewing a couple of people, maybe only interviewing one person, and then understanding the processes that researchers go through when they do these methods. The other situation is just the term paper or research essay situation where depending on the course and depending on the instructor, there could be a some sort of open-ended topic choice, right? So students might be able to choose whatever topic they want, or there might be some sort of basic broad topic and students choose something from, some narrower piece that fits within that broader topic. Those are the two main. That's not to say those are the only things that are going to happen in a classroom, but those are the two main ones that would happen in the majority of courses or would cover the majority of courses. In the graduate student situation, now you're talking about, mostly it's independent research of a broader scope, very different from the undergraduate situation. But it also differs from a non-student researcher situation in that it's independent research, but it's under supervision of a faculty member. But the piece there that I guess is most should be focused on is that there's this limited time frame when you're talking about graduate students, and especially if it's a master's project, a very small time frame. So you have limited time frames compared to faculty researchers or just researchers in general that are not students who have 2 or 5 year projects or things that they just work on their entire careers, and they set those times themselves. With students in the undergraduate situation, you're talking about 12 or 13 weeks. And with graduate students, some of those could also be term-based, but also sometimes an entire master's might only be a year, 2 years tops usually. And so you have a limited period of time. And this is where I think people get nervous about having to look at the RIIG policy, because they're worried about the length of time that it might take for them to establish relationships, to then be able to talk to Indigenous communities about consent, and then to get that consent, and then to be able to do the project. So, so anyway, let's talk about the different situations. And at the end of this, there will be time for questions. And I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. I will say that some things might be so specific that they require a totally separate conversation, because it depends. A lot of this is contextual or situational, but I'm happy to answer as best I can. So talking about undergraduate students and the Research Impacting Indigenous Groups policy, if you look in the policy, I don't mean you have to do that right now, but later on, it's section 5. It only has 2 clauses. And so this is a situation where, let's say, for example, a student wants to interview a family member or a friend. Or maybe that's the assignment, depending on the course, that you need to go find someone and interview them. Or a student proposes a research essay project that involves an Indigenous person, community, or territory. And so what instructors need to be very aware of when they're planning their courses, and then when students are coming to them during the course, is that 12, 13-week finite piece of time, and what can be accomplished in that amount of time. So over the course of anyone's teaching career, we have to employ creative pedagogical approaches depending on things that happen in the world and requirements of our university and so on. I mean, I can remember when a syllabus was just like a half a page, and really just kind of like had the instructor's name and office number, whatever their office hours were. And over time, we've been, I guess, required in many cases to add different elements to a syllabus in terms of it being this sort of agreement between instructor and student. We need to include things about accessibility. We need to include information on how a student can get help with accessibility issues, or perhaps we include information on the Writing Center and so on, and we are required to include goals and learning objectives and things like that. So we're used to those kinds of changes. As instructors, this happens over time, and anyone who is engaged in their own teaching is going to update their syllabus anyway. I mean, even if someone wasn't telling you to do so. So we employ creative approaches all the time. And we also have situations all the time where students might come and propose something that we know they cannot complete. A topic that would require them to visit an archive in someplace outside of the local area. And when those things happen, we just naturally redirect students to something that might still fit within the thing that you see that they're very interested in, but is something that's doable. It's something that they'll be able to complete. And this is part of pedagogy. This is part of us being instructors. It's part of us guiding students, is we have to react to changes that happen and then pass that learning and that understanding on to students, right? So if a student comes to you with something that they want to do as a project, and you realize this isn't going to be possible because of this, we only have 13 weeks and they didn't come until, I know that in my time as chair of the RIIG committee, we had a couple of situations where undergraduate students approached an instructor like the first week of March, let's say, and they wanted all of a sudden to do something that involves interviewing Indigenous people for this research paper, and the paper's due at the end of March. Like, that's not possible. It's not possible to engage with Indigenous communities, to talk to them about consent, and to then get that consent, especially as a student, and then have a paper that's finished by the end of like 3 weeks later. It's not possible. So I'm going to talk about how to avoid that also, but it's our responsibility as instructors to sort of learn and keep up with what's happening. So the reason that I mentioned that 2018 TCPS 2 clause 2.1 is that several people that I've talked to have actually just argued with me that that's not there, it's not true, that it's not in the policy statement, but it is. And this is just, you know, like I said, depending on when you came up in your own education, what you might have been engaging with the 1998 version of, or maybe even before that, before there was even a policy. And when those things get edited, we only engage in the pieces of them that we know already affect us, or that we know already engage with our own research. And so it's very possible that people could have looked at the new one and never noticed that the very first paragraph in the introduction, I think it is, specifically says that classroom-based work is part of that. So instructors have a responsibility in helping to prepare students. So when we talk about methods, or we talk about research methods, if we talk about oral history methods, this includes methods of conducting research that impacts Indigenous groups. I mean, we teach students about archival research. We take them or we send them to the library as a regular thing, sometimes every term for some instructors, so that they go and get information on how to conduct research. And while we're in a period of time where many people are really just learning about the RIIG policy, this is something that we also have to do. This is part of our responsibility in terms of preparing students. In terms of, if a student is an undergrad and they're working on a research project in your classroom, or if you're teaching a methods course and they're learning research methods, if they're not learning Indigenous research methods, or if they're not learning about the Research Impacting Indigenous Groups policy, or even pieces of the TCPS2, they're not actually learning all of the things that constitute research. And they're going to end up in situations with the growing interest in Indigenous groups that they might be a graduate student then and have absolutely no idea how to respectfully engage Indigenous groups. And this goes also back to, it's a problem in the sense that none of us learned any of this when we were coming up in school. And so it's difficult for instructors who don't have any background in Indigenous research to have students coming to them wanting to do Indigenous research, or to be teaching methods courses and to not have the background to be able to teach that part of it. And so these are opportunities to have guests come into the classroom and talk about the policy. But the biggest thing is to think ahead. So I'm going to talk just about grad students a bit, and then I will mention a few ways that you can work with the policy and have it work for you. So graduate students, Section 6 of the RIIG policy talks about graduate students. So it's sections 5 and 6 really that involve students. And as I said, with the graduate students, you're talking about timelines and the completion of necessary components. So if, you know, a proposal is due by a certain time, and if it doesn't get done by that time, this is going to push everything else back. We've had situations where in the past year, grad students are applying for certain types of funding and they never knew that the RIIG policy existed, some of the grad students. Over time, that's going to be remedied because each new group that comes in is going to get that information, but we still have grad students who don't know anything about it. And then they find out about it like the day before something is due, a proposal or a funding request. And if it's the day before, it's too late for you to be able to follow the policy. So what can you do? What can you do as an instructor? What can you do as a faculty supervisor? So clause 5.2 in the RIIG policy, it leaves it open for the potential to seek consent for an entire class or for multiple semesters. So if you teach, like, let's say you teach the same 1000 level in whatever discipline you're in, and that class always includes some certain assignment that you know multiple students want to do on Indigenous peoples or Indigenous communities, or if you're specifically teaching a methods course where you include something like oral history methods or research methods, and that you might end up having projects or small projects that you assign that include Indigenous peoples. Clause 5.2 in the RIIG policy allows you to consider ways to get consent over multiple terms. So if you teach the same course every term or every fall, that you could approach Indigenous groups. And if you think about in this province and in this university, the vast majority of students that come to this university are actually from the province. So the bulk of any Indigenous groups that you might be talking about are in this province. That's not to say that it would always be the case, but you can be sure that the bulk of requests from students to do projects with Indigenous peoples is going to be mostly people inside the province. And so you're talking about 5 broad groups. And you, as an instructor, or even a unit, if there's a unit that has multiple courses where this happens, can establish relationships yourselves, or if you already have existing relationships, you can use those relationships to then talk to those communities about the class that you teach. Say, I teach an oral history class every fall, and these are the kinds of projects that we do. And I would love it if we would be able to work with you, et cetera, and set up an agreement. And this is for concept development, so that what they're agreeing to is the concept of what you're doing. It doesn't mean that Indigenous groups are going to come into your classroom every week and watch what you're doing or participate in your teaching. It means that you have this specific project that you want students to do, and you're seeking consent from those Indigenous communities because you know that students are invariably going to ask to interview Indigenous people. So clause 5.2, and if you want like a more substantial conversation around how to do that, I'm happy if you contact me. So another thing that you can do is to make a note on every syllabus. Any syllabus in a course where students have some level of autonomy in choosing research topics, so that if they propose to do something undoable, and by undoable I usually mean because of time constraints, then you can redirect them to something doable as you would in any situation. But if you put a note in your syllabus about this, and again, I can talk to you privately about how you might word that, but if you put a note in a syllabus so the student knows, so that they look at the schedule and they see that something is due March 29th, and it's a research project, just the nature of how we all go to school, most of us, we procrastinate. So if you make a note in the syllabus someplace prominent that if they have an interest in conducting any sort of research on Indigenous topics, that they need to consult the RIIG policy, but actually it would mean probably talking to you, but to just make them aware that that this is something they need to be aware of if they're planning on something to be due March 29th, so that they might need to fix if it's possible, to fix their topic from the very beginning, especially if, let's say, they're a member of an Indigenous group, and so they would already have connections to that group or to that band office, and they'd be able to go in and say, I'm doing this school project, et cetera, I just need to get your input and some consent for me to do it. That they might still be able to do that project by the end of the term, but if they don't come to you with that topic until March 5th, they're not going to be able to do it. And the third thing that you can do is and this is important, to establish relationships on your own over time that can be renewed or continued with your students, whether they're undergraduate or graduate students. And so this could include forming a relationship with a community where you find out from an Indigenous community what projects they actually have an interest in for their community, where student researchers might be of assistance. And we have several units in the university that are doing this already. And I'll highlight Ivan here, who is, introduced all of this. He's involved, we wouldn't even be able to name how many, but he's involved in a number of, or has been over years, a number of research projects that stem from something that the community wants to do, and then a unit at the university assists them in whatever their project is, and then uses students to do that research with them. I mean, right now I'm just thinking of Brennan, who's in the session. and some other, and Brady, who's also in the session. Oh, that's great. So there are all kinds of ways that you can creatively figure out how to handle this. And I think the best way is to already establish a relationship and then know that, okay, I have this oral history class coming up. I'm going to contact, if it was Ivan who was the liaison, I'm going to contact Ivan and find out what he thinks. And then you have this ready-made project that you can then assign to your students instead of flipping it the other way, which is how we normally do things in a Western-based institution. And that is to have our own ideas about what we want to do and then go to Indigenous communities and ask them to participate. So I'm hoping there are lots of questions, but I'm going to stop there and then see if there are some questions.
And if you have a question and you want to ask, just there you go, raise your hand and you can do it. You can completely unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can put it in the chat and I can read it. It's up to you guys. So Edwin, you're up. And you're still muted, but you're on camera, so we can see that you're muted.
Pardon me. Oh my goodness, it's cool. Anyway, so I apologize for that. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. It's been very helpful. And so, in historical studies, we have independent projects that we do for their fourth year students. And we I think we've had, I don't know if we've had somebody who in the past has requested to interview, say, like, for example, Indigenous elder, but say like if they wanted to do research on say Indigenous veterans in the First World War, like I guess it would still be, I think it would be, they should really consult the RIIG policy at that, or the prof should consult the RIIG policy at that point. I mean, because I think it isn't, it's not something that might not be published, the paper, but they are put on, like they're available to the public, to the student body, and the library. So I think in that respect, so it is in some ways disseminated and there's public presentations and so on done by the students. So that would be appropriate then, wouldn't it, like for even if the student is not interviewing people who are still alive, but I would think it would be a good idea to yeah.
Yeah, thanks for using an actual example, because yes, so what I would say to anyone is no matter what program you're talking about, there's honors thesis that undergrads might write. There are projects in just a regular course. There's a graduate student project. There should be, whenever you do introductory conversations about something. So whenever students coming up to the point where they're going to start doing their honors thesis, there are parameters, right? You sit down and you talk about same thing with someone entering grad school. At that point, the RIIG policy should be part of that natural conversation, right? Like it doesn't even matter if you know anything about what the person thinks they might talk about. You're going to talk about a bunch of other things that they need to consider. So the RIIG policy should just be kind of dropped into that whole initial conversation so that when they're thinking, I mean, some students already know way ahead what they want to talk about, and other times they need some guidance. They have a general idea of some big topic, and you have to kind of help them winnow it down into something, right? That's when those conversations should take place. And it's also worth noting that the engagement with the RIIG policy isn't limited to things that are only going to be disseminated, because there's the impact on Indigenous peoples also happens at the time of interview, right? So I know personally I've had a couple of very bad experiences where the interview questions were, and what I know from engaging with the person, it wasn't intentional, but the interview questions were horrifyingly offensive, and some people could be harmed just by that, right? So that's the reason that we want to have that Indigenous peoples have said, we need to have more education on this.
Yeah, thank you.
And there's a question in the chat, so I'm guessing that prompts me to read it rather than ask them to ask it. I teach at Nunavut Art College. This is Jim, by the way, and we have an MOU with MUN. We often have elders speak to our classes, and papers also reflect experiences within our communities, which are Inuit communities, a part of the Land Claims Agreement. In these cases, will we be required to be aware and abide by these policies, and how can we access this policy?
That's a good question. And so I know a little bit about the agreement between Arctic College and Memorial, but I don't know all the parameters. So I don't know if, for example, if the students are considered to be Memorial students. So I would need to actually look more at that MOU. But the policy would cover anyone who's part of Memorial University, right? So if it's an instructor or a student, and then it covers research they would do anywhere if they are with Memorial University. And I think it also there are some interpretations that include anyone who's applying for funding through Memorial University, even if they are not part of Memorial University, but if the funding is coming from Memorial. So I'd be happy to look into that though, to be sure. But it would depend on, by definition, whether students are considered Memorial students.
Yeah, thanks, Kellyanne. This is Jim, and I'm in Cambridge Bay and work with the social service work program up here. We have BSW students that are working with the program in Memorial, but they report directly to Memorial. Our students, a lot of them are going to be applying to the BSW program, but at this point in time, they're in the diploma program here. And so I wasn't just hearing this. I think it's really important and interesting because we refer, when I teach research and introductory research to our students, we talk about NRI, the Nunavut Research Institute, ITK agreements, and those types of things, but wasn't aware of the RIIG. So I wanted to take part and see that, and if it had any impact on us being in Nunavut and those types of things, because there isn't really formal research going on, but there certainly are students, because they have such strong connections to the community. Majority of our students are Inuit, so they connect with elders and they interview elders for the purpose of some of their papers without going through that type of thing. But it's more of a much more of a personal type situation, but could be conveyed as research as well, right? So as that goes on. So I'm just inquiring around it just to see how that looks, right?
Yeah, I really appreciate your participation and bringing this up too, because I think you would have a different experience because the majority of your students are Indigenous students, right? You would have a different experience than someone who might not even know if any Indigenous students are in their classroom, right? And also, I think that I can send you the link to the policy. I'd be happy to do that. But I think that you'd find, because you're a person who's clearly involved in Indigenous research kind of as part of your regular everyday, this is just every day, you might not find anything in the policy to be very interesting, because it's like just how to be, how to be respectful, and you're probably already doing everything that it says. But yeah, I'd be happy to send that to you.
Yeah, and I've been in this community for 7 years now, so those personal relationships and engaging with elders and that type of thing has become kind of natural in that respect. So and working with that, and I've had a lot of mentors teaching me many things up here as well. But for our students, it's very new to look at this as a case of, instead of talking to their Anana or Adada, and they're now looking at it from, they're gaining information from them around family, around experience, around traditions, and those types of things, and putting it into a document. So just something that kind of was interesting to me to see how we go around that. So sorry to bother you with that.
Oh, it's fascinating. I appreciate it. Thank you. And I think Ivan has put the policy into the chat, so you can grab it there.
Awesome. Yeah, I see that. Thank you. Thanks, Ivan.
No problem.
And thanks, Kellyanne.
Thank you. Anyone else with a question?
I see Brady Reed has his hand up. You may speak.
Hello, thanks. I may speak.
Hi.
A quick question going back to something you brought up, and I know you sort of said, do this on a one-on-one basis, but I don't know if you have sort of general advice maybe around syllabus design in general. But there's a course this summer, an independent course, similar to what Edmund was talking about, an independent project style course where students are working with communities. And I'm wondering, I want to put something like that in the syllabus to say, if this is the way your project is going to go or whatever, then there's policies you have to follow. So I don't know if there's sort of like general advice, and we can talk about it after, of course, but just sort of general advice for syllabus design when you think about including some of those aspects.
Yeah, I think that it's, everyone's got, usually you see the contact info and then you have learning objectives or a description of the course or whatever. And I think in those sections, that's at the top or the first page or top of the second page or something, is where you would want to insert a section on, you could frame it depending on your approach. You could frame it just as policies and then just say there are a variety of policies you may need to consult and then include RIIG as one of them. Or you might specifically put a section called Research Impacting Indigenous Groups and then say, there's a growing interest in research, et cetera, and this university has a policy that you need to be aware of, and so on. Because what I think most people are seeing and the things that people have shared with me is that there is an increase in student interest because since 2015 with the TRC Commission and the calls to action, there's been a lot more discussion around Indigenous peoples. We see the federal holiday now for Truth and Reconciliation, that there's just a lot more conversation. And what ends up happening is more people are interested. We also, as I said, we didn't learn all of this in school. And so students want to do research. So it wouldn't be odd to just have a section called Research Impacting Indigenous Groups in your syllabus. And again, if you're not yourself super familiar with it, it's fine to reach out and ask questions. And the same thing with, how do I establish relationships with Indigenous communities? For some people that they may not even really know where to start. There is an FAQ or several different FAQ sections. If you go into the MUN website and you type in Indigenous research, and it'll take you to that. It's within the research portfolio, but there are contact information, but there's also the FAQs about how to, what not to do and what to do. Oh, thanks, Ivan. He's popped that into the chat. I think we're almost out of time. Does anyone else have a question?
I love dead air so much. It's thank yous, not questions, streaming into the chat. So you said we are almost out of time. I'd say we're possibly done unless someone wants to come in clutch with a surprise question in this last minute.
Well, I will just say to anyone who's in the session, you can also email me with a question, and I can.
I also put that in the chat earlier.
Did you? Okay, yeah, everyone
Yeah.
has my email address then too, yeah. Well, thanks everybody. I really appreciate your attention and your participation.
Thank you, Kelly, for having me as your social moderator. I forget what I'm supposed to be called, but thank you.
Thank you, Ivan.